A says, is a state necessarily centralized with power monopolized in the hands of a few? Some argue that the state is just the organization, administrative organs of society. Both liberals and MLs argue this. Yeah, I think this is a preferential definition that doesn't fit the historic development and fact of the state. So the MLs, for example, they conceive that there could be some other kind of state. The anarchists will lay out an alternative structure for society. And the Marxists will respond, well, that's a state. The problem is that you might have just explained communism to them, which is a stateless, classless, moneyless society, and yet they still insist that it's a state. And the reason why that this weird, erroneous conclusion is taking place is because they've overbroadened the meaning of the state to be almost meaningless. So what we see historically is what the state is, as it has developed, is a monopolization and centralization of power in the hands of a few. There has never been a state in all of history that is decentralized and power rises from the bottom up. And there's a reason for this, because that definition of the state that's being used by liberals and MLs doesn't fit the actual material, historical reality of the state. Anarchists are defining the state by what it is, not by what somebody wants it to be, not by what people theorize it could be in some abstract alternate reality, okay? Anarchists want to look at what the state is, what it factually is, both now and by all historical example. And by historical example, it is what the anarchists say it is. So here's the thing. What we come up to is they say, okay, well, there have been states which have been bottom up, and they give us an example of like stateless societies. We'll talk about indigenous people. Some indigenous people maybe could be argued to have had a state, but other indigenous people did not have anything you could call a state. What they had was essentially a bottom-up, directly democratic form of self-governance, which the anarchists would support. And you can see how the category is erroneous insofar as that now they're calling stateless societies we all just agree are stateless. Their definition now categorizes those as state societies. In which case, what I've had to point out is, well, this definition of the state is so incoherent that it's impossible to have statelessness, and there's no way any future coordination of communist society could be stateless, and therefore you have a contradiction in terms. You essentially have that communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless society, yet your definition of the state insists that communism will still have a state, because you're just defining every form of governance or organization as a state. So the long and short of it is just that the ML and liberal definition of the state is incoherent. And I should say further, Marx's definition of the state is just generally incoherent. It doesn't make sense. It's too broad to be useful. It doesn't have enough specificity to apply to a real political organizational structure that exists. To me, I think it really just developed as a rhetorical tool to differentiate themselves from anarchist and libertarian socialists, who they saw being broadly anti-state. And they would define the state in this very particular way in order to kind of score a gotcha. But let's see here. Engels, palaver about the state. Engels actually, after the Paris Commune in 1875, wrote a letter to August Bebel in which he said, all the palaver about the state ought to be dropped, especially after the Commune, which had ceased to be a state in the true sense of the term. The people's state has been flung in our teeth ad nauseum by the anarchists, although Marx's anti-Proudhon piece, and after it, the Communist Manifesto, declare outright that with the introduction of the socialist order of society, the state will dissolve of itself and disappear. Now, since the state is merely a transitional institution of which use is made in the struggle, in the revolution, to keep down one's enemies by force, it is utter nonsense to speak of a free people's state. So long as the proletariat still makes use of the state, it makes use of it, not for the purpose of freedom, but of keeping down its enemies. And as soon as there can be any question of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist. We would therefore suggest that Gemeinwesen, commonality, be universally substituted for state. It's a good old German word that can very well do service for the French commune. So what you can gather here is Engels is recognizing that the word state doesn't really make a lot of sense in the conditions we're discussing here. He's like, here's the way we had been using it, but like, now that we actually kind of have an example of what this transitional dictatorship of the proletariat might look like in practice, it doesn't really look anything like a state. It almost needs a different name. And he even mentions the anarchists, because the anarchists had basically been saying this for all this time. So here we have in 1875, Engels recognizing that the definition that they're using for the state doesn't make sense. It's kind of an incoherent word to apply to the circumstances of people empowerment, decentralization of power. Hopefully that was a useful answer.